Nationally, this flu season was a little bit busier than last year, or than an average year, let's say, but not completely out of hand. Well, the flu season always comes in a peak. So it starts usually around December or so, and it goes through the winter, and by mid-March, it's pretty much gone. Year after year, the only exception was the swine flu year in 2009, when it came unbelievably early in April is when it started. But that's an anomaly. Almost always it'll come just during the wintertime. There was about an equal split between flu A and flu B strains this year.
Is that normal?
We often see more than one, yes. Well, it's just a way of testing them, what the surface looks like in the lab, and so they're just two different types. In general, flu A is a little bit more severe than flu B, but either one can be pretty bad. For most people, if you get a good case of the flu, you'll get a fever and be in bed and ache all over. Those are the main symptoms for most adults. But as you said, for people who are immune compromised or who are otherwise ill, have chronic lung disease or heart disease, it can be much more serious. And for people who are elderly, over 65, and the more over 65 you are, the more serious it has a potential to be. And then conversely, the small babies tend to be sicker than the older kids. You know, we have had flu immunization available for many years now, and it's a pretty effective vaccine. Not perfect, but it'll completely prevent symptoms about 70% of the time. And then for those who receive the vaccine and still get the flu anyway, there's still a measure of protection. So if you had the vaccine and you got the flu, I'll tell you, you're lucky you had the vaccine, because you would have been much more sick if you hadn't. Yeah, there are some years where the virus drifts away from what the vaccine thought it was going to be, drifts away from what the vaccine makers thought it was going to be, and so the vaccine might be a little less protective in those years. And this year, the match was pretty close, though. But in spite of that, we still had a pretty good epidemic.
No.
Well, the good news is that the field of vaccinology, the people who produce vaccines, are working on better vaccines than we've had in the past. So as time goes by, we're going to get vaccines that are more and more effective. We're doing real well right now because we're nationally and here in central Missouri, the rates of flu have dropped way down. So we're almost to the end of the epidemic. There may be a few straggling cases over the next couple of weeks, and then it'll be gone.
Next season.
Well, the experts are already well into planning for next season. If this is the time of the year where they have to make a best possible guess as to what the strains are going to be a year from now. And they base that by looking at strains all over the world, particularly in the southern hemisphere where they're going into winter now, and we have a look at what strains are existing in the southern hemisphere, and those are ones, for example, that are more likely to show up here the following winter. Influenza stays with the human population year-round, and in our winter time, it takes a big jump here, and during the winter time in the southern hemisphere, which would be our summer, it's active there. So it moves around the country depending on where the weather is the best. And even in the tropics where it's never cold, they tend to have flu more year-round. So this year's strains were pretty much similar to any other year. This was not a particularly unusual year for particularly virulent or unusual strains. But flu is unpredictable, and so from one year to the next, we really are sometimes caught by surprise in terms of a strain being different than we thought it was going to be. It certainly is. So vaccination is a very good way to help prevent disease, and it's now recommended for everyone, no matter how old or young you are, down to 6 months of age at least, on up through elderly. And there are different actually forms of vaccine that are available that are better for different age groups, for example. Yeah, well, the virus changes a little bit from year to year, usually, and sometimes a lot from one year to the next. And if it changes a little bit, we try to be ahead of it with a vaccine that's anticipated that. As I said, sometimes it doesn't quite match because the virus has changed in unpredictable ways. And the concern is always with influenza is that it may change in some way to make it a much more serious virus than even the average flu. We had that concern during the swine flu years, the 2009-2010 winter. There was a big shift in the virus, and that virus was very pandemic. It spread early. As I mentioned, it spread in April instead of the usual time it started spreading, and it went around the world. The rates of infection were high. The saving grace was that people over age 60 had immunity to it. And so actually they were protected from this virus, or things would have been much worse. So we sort of dodged a bullet during that winter.
His concerns.
Well, probably the biggest question I get is a foolish question, which is, I'm not going to take that vaccine because it makes me sick. And the truth of the matter is, this has been scientifically studied, and the only side effect that's actually attributable to the vaccine is a bit of a sore arm. All those other symptoms that people get after the vaccine, they would have gotten anyway, it turns out, because we give the vaccine during virus season in October or so, November, when there are many other viruses around you happen to get after you got the vaccine. And the main things to know about how to prevent the flu are simple, practical matters like if you cough or sneeze, use your sleeve. If you're sick, try to avoid other people. If you're a vulnerable person by being elderly or having chronic lung disease, stay away from places where there are people who are sick and wash your hands.